1,000,000 voices. Hi, I'm Katia Dopos, and this is 1,000,000 Voices, where inspirational speakers share their stories and champion organizations that are making a difference in the world. Hello, welcome to a new episode of 1,000,000 Voices. It's a real pleasure to introduce our special guest today. With a fascinating life and an extraordinary career, she's a leading expert in fashion, luxury, lifestyle, and Paris. Journalist and author Natasha Fraser-Cavassoni has written over a dozen books on remarkable creatives, such as Christian Dior, film producer Sam Spiegel, Calvin Klein, Loulou de la Falaise, and Yves St. Natasha was famously the last person hired by Andy Warhol to work at his studio. Her celebrated memoir, After Andy, Adventures in Warholand, takes us on a fascinating journey into the pop icon's inner circle and enduring legacy. The book also gives us insights into Natasha's own incredible story, from London It Girl to working for iconic figures from Karl Lagerfeld at Chanel to John Fairchild at W Magazine and Women's Wear Daily. She was also European editor at Harper's Bazaar and the co-producer of the two-part television series Inside Dior. Natasha regularly contributes to some of the world's most influential fashion and art magazines, and often teaches fashion journalism at the American University in Paris. Hi, Natasha. Thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you?
Very happy to be in Paris. Very happy to see you, Katja.
So happy to see you too. How are things with you? How was life under lockdown? I mean, it's been in Paris, it was many weeks under lockdown. Now things are beginning to reopen again. And how are things with you?
Well, I have to say I was very lucky because I live with my daughters. And that was the plus side of COVID, which was seeing so much of them. But professionally, it wasn't a huge difference because I work at home and, I write from home. And I just felt incredibly grateful. The supermarket's next door. Paris is very beautiful. It was very strange, a bit like being on a film set, because I'd never seen Paris empty. And it was very strange and quite eerie, quite sinister, walking around all these beautiful buildings and there being nobody.
Well, Natasha, I really would love to talk to you about your adventures in Warholand. And what do I mean by that? When we first met, you had just written a book called After Andy, Adventures in Warholand. This is the book. And I invite everybody to read it. It's a fascinating read. It's so interesting because, of course, not only it tells your story, how you became a fashion journalist and a writer, but it reveals a lot about society and art and culture and everything that was exciting that was going on in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, in cities like London, New York, Los Angeles, and Paris, of course. And it's so interesting because it shows also that Andy Warhol was a huge influence in your life, in your career. But also he was an inspiration to a lot of people, great people that you have worked with. And one thing that you say in the book, and I'm going to read it because it's so great. You say, Andy gave you the impression you could do anything by just looking at you. And that tells a lot about how Andy Warhol connected with people. So how was it for you when you first met Andy? And then you were the last person to be hired to work for Warhol Studios just before he passed away. Yes. So how was, this journey in Warholand for you?
I met him in 1980, but obviously I knew all about him because of the weekly magazines, those weekend magazines like The Observer and the Sunday Times. and I knew about him from my father. But I met Andy in January 1980, and I was 16 years old, and it was at a lunch organized by someone called Marguerite Lippmann, who was a great friend of his from the 60s. She'd thrown a party for him, and it was all white. So there we were, and it was Andy Warhol, Bianca Jagger, Fred Hughes, who was Andy's manager, and others such as John Richardson, who was then, he became very famous as Picasso's biographer, but he was then just an art expert, very popular. Anyway, I met Andy, and he tried to fix me up with an Armani model who is known as John Stockwell. And he used to refer to him as Beauty. But it amazed me. I just thought, he was so instantly recognizable with that white hair and that somber jacket and jeans. He looked exactly like he did in the photographs. I had no idea that his hair was a wig. No idea. No, even when I discovered it, actually, when I was writing the book, it didn't occur to me that that hair was a wig. And I think that's very interesting, because there was something about Andy that for my generation, he didn't look weird. But I think for older people, he did. And I had lived through punk, and I'd lived through all sorts of things. So Andy did not look strange. I thought he was incredibly nice, very funny, not at all shy, mischievous. People say he was so difficult to talk to. I don't agree, not in my experience. In my experience, Andy Warhol was not difficult to talk to. Mm. And I was very amused by him. And then I followed him. We went to the party that night at Regine's, and I remember following him around, and all the cameras. I'd never seen so many cameras. And then Bianca Jagger arrived, and she was wearing Holstein, and all these people were gathering around him. But he wasn't at all possessive of his turf. That's what I felt about Warhol. It was very, come, be here. He was very happy to be surrounded, happy to be inclusive. I mean, he was the star, but I just felt that there were many in his orbit. He seemed very happy in London. He kept on saying, oh, everyone's so beautiful. He loved physiques. He loved different physiques. And I do think in London, you do see the most beautiful people, not necessarily elegant in a way that Parisians are, but physically, the faces are actually a lot more interesting in my experience. They're raw and not necessarily the hair color may be wrong, but they're very fascinating. And I could tell he was really intrigued. He was very happy.
He was in his element, would you say that?
I mean, I think he was a very shy guy, but driven by curiosity. And there he was at this party, and everyone was there. You sense that anyone who was anyone was there. Everyone who was anyone was there.
And you, of course, worked for Warhol Studio. Just before he passed away, you were hired.
Yes, I worked. That was when I was 16. I met him when I was 16, and I met him over the years. And then he employed me. He employed me in 1987. I was the last person to be employed at Warhol Studio. And he was doing a TV show called Andy Warhol MTV. And it was him interviewing people. And he wanted someone with a European accent to interview people, other people. It was all part of that. A big melting pot.
The English muffins that you mentioned, which
Yes,
is
I became the fifth and last English muffin, because English muffin was the expression, the name given to English women working at the Warhol studio.
that's one of the things that's so fascinating about your book, is that it's a journey that you follow and you understand the ambiance, what was going on behind the scenes as well in different cities. And you learn a lot about Andy's character as well. And one thing that I didn't know, at least when I read the book, I mean, some things that he was a herder, he had a huge collection of things, but he had a fantastic work ethic. But you tell the story that, for instance, of course, there was the 60s movement and then the 70s, but then he was never really recognized in the art world as he should. And he also financially, I mean, of course, now his pieces can be sold for millions and millions of pounds. But back then, like many other artists before him, he was actually going to Europe, for instance, to paint portraits. And that's very interesting and fascinating. And like many artists before him as well, the final recognition of his talent came after his death. And why do you think that was?
Well, I mean, I have to say, Andy was definitely, the Pope of pop. So in the 60s, he was totally recognized. And then this very cruel thing happened, which was then when he was almost assassinated. They decided, the art world, the critics, who had a huge power then, decided he was over at the end of the 60s. It was very cruel. Whereas Europe had just discovered him. I mean, just discovered it's not, but his first retrospective was in Sweden. So you have this guy, and it was Warhol's manager, Fred Hughes, who had the idea to do these portraits. And he did Brigitte Bardot, Willy Brandt of Germany. I mean, he did all these portraits. But what's interesting is France always recognized him as the great American artist. Whereas America had a problem with him. He did too much. Who was he? Was he a socialite? There he was with Bianca Jagger. There he was at Studio 54. They couldn't put him in the box. And at that time, you had people like Jasper Johns, who were with German curators and having intense dinners. And Andy was doing that, but yet photographed at Studio 54 or somewhere else. He was pushing it all the time. And that was resented. Yet now he was a prototype for what every young artist wants to be like Andy Warhol. I mean, Irving Bloom, who showed Warhol in the 60s, told me, every single young artist only wants to know about Warhol because they want to do what he did. He was so ahead of his time. You almost needed Warhol to have Koons, to have Hearst. I mean, it's fascinating. Yet he was very criticized at the time and very underpriced. And that hurt him because, for him, money meant a lot. He was in the studio working, and then he went out and he was selling advertisements for his magazine Interview, Andy Warhol's Interview. And if he wasn't selling interviews, he was seeing people who he could do portraits of. His big line was, "I've got to keep the lights on." And he never stopped. I really admire that, because at the end, if you read his diaries, it was rough. You had people like Julian Schnabel, who was very, all the young artists like Julian Schnabel, everyone was very keen on them, and Warhol had been eclipsed. It was rough, but he didn't stop. And now, of course, everyone wants to buy his paintings. But it is interesting. He almost had to die. I quoted a very good Austrian gallery owner called Tadeusz Ropak, who said Andy almost had to die for us to appreciate his body of work. It was just so huge. And yet he was a hoarder, and he kept everything, and no one knew. He refused. He did not insure anything. Nothing was insured because he didn't want to know. He didn't want others to know what he possessed. And for instance, when I arrived at Warhol's studio, there was an enormous roll of Elvises. Elvis, which must now go for about 100 million, or perhaps more, because the prices are just going on and on. But you cut them. There was a triple Elvis and there was a double Elvis. You cut them. There was the roll, and it was where he did gym. It was where he did his gymnastics. So that was very fascinating. But he was definitely, when he died, he was on a low. He died on a low.
And at his home, he had pieces of other artists on display rather than his own work.
Yes, which I think is so telling. He was so humble. But in my experience, I had the luck to work for Karl Lagerfeld and other people. And I've worked with, and there's something very humble about the great. They're not thinking, oh, I'm so great. They're actually getting on and doing it.
We sadly lost Karl Lagerfeld in 2019, and we saw people from all over the world paying tribute. He was admired by so many people. And what's interesting is that you often see when people refer to Karl, they refer to him as an artist. And interestingly enough, you mentioned in the book that he rejected that. He didn't want to be called an artist. He was a fashion stylist. And my next question is about your experience working for him, because in 1989, you go to Paris and you go to work for Karl Lagerfeld at Chanel. How was it, this amazing experience working for Karl Lagerfeld?
He was very kind to me. I didn't speak much French, and he used to tease me that I spent my life on the telephone. What's interesting about Warhol, Karl Lagerfeld was in one of his films. They knew each other. That was what was interesting about working for Lagerfeld. He had been in one of Warhol's films. And of course, Warhol had done those Chanel bottles. So there was this weird, but working for Karl Lagerfeld, extraordinary. I mean, it was just extraordinary. I'd never met anyone like him. And he was very kind to the models. And he would have all his drawings, these beautiful drawings, which he did with Chanel makeup. He colored them in. He did all his own sketches. Some people say, oh, no, he did all his own sketches. And he would use a little gold pen for the buttons. They were beautiful. And they would be up on a board, and he would refer to them. And he was so focused, always late. Lagerfeld was always late. And when I was, I worked for him when I was 26, it drove me mad. And on Fridays, it drove everyone mad because people wanted to get home. And he was always late. It's because he was buying books or he was writing letters. He was a great letter writer. Every morning, Karl Lagerfeld would read 3 newspapers from cover to cover.
Wow.
And he spoke 4 languages. I mean, he could tell jokes in 4 languages. He was very funny. But he would laugh because he said, you used to spend your life on the telephone. Because I was so nervous about not speaking French. And there are all these beautiful Linda Evangelista, all these, I mean, it was like being on Mount Olympus, the beauty of these young women. And I was so nervous, I would be calling all my girlfriends, finding out what was going on in Notting Hill Gate. And there was Fashion Central in front of me. But Karl was very amused. He just couldn't believe it. He always said, you spent your life on the telephone, because I was nervous.
But then I think it was perfect because you became a journalist, fashion journalist. And, you know, journalists spend their lives talking to other people on the phone.
It was a good job. Karl was annoyed I left Chanel. And he said to my next boss, John Fairchild, who was Women's Wear Daily and W Magazine, Women's Wear Daily was then the fashion Bible. And Karl was annoyed that I was leaving Chanel to join the fashion Bible. And he said to John Fairchild, she spends her life on the telephone. And John Fairchild said, good, Karl, because that's what journalists do. So I was lucky.
But also he used, I mean, Karl used your some of your prints and designs, correct? For scarves.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I showed him because someone who died, unfortunately, called Min Hogg, who was the editor of Interiors. I'd seen her in New York and she said, so what are you going to do? You're just going to go to Paris like that? No one could understand that I was leaving New York to go to Paris. I couldn't really speak French. I'd done lessons at Alliance Française, but I couldn't really speak French. And I'd never gone to fashion school. And Min Hogg said, and she was tough, Min, she said, you're just going to go like that. You should do some sketches. So I did do sketches, and I did, and then I met Lacroix, Jean-Jacques Picard, who then ran Christian Lacroix, and he looked at my sketches and said, you know, do some ideas for scarves. And it was funny because I did these ideas and he said, they're too Chanel for us. And one of them was a teapot pouring out jewels. It was all done with decoupage. You know, I used Christie's and Sotheby's catalogs and I used their jewels. And Karl looked at it and he chose one and he got a big piece of paper and he said, okay. And he just drew the teapots going different ways. And there we had, and I had a material. And then the next material was cards. And the third material was flying clocks. He was very nice. He always said to people, Natasha did this material. He was very generous.
And of course, the way that he kept Chanel always current, that was fascinating.
And he was very loyal. He loved Virginie Viard, who's now running it, now the creative director. And they had an amazing relationship. And it's exciting. She's a woman. She'll go,
Indeed.
you know, and I've loved her shows. And, but it was interesting. He was so, if you said to Karl, I loved your last show, he was annoyed. He only wanted to talk about the present.
Ah, that's interesting. And his shows became a point of, I mean, everybody was always waiting to see what was coming, because it was a really theatrical experience, wasn't it? I mean, it's not only the fashion, but the whole, the scene, the mood, the music, everything was special about it.
Chanel experience. And I was very lucky because the 90s and then the early 2000s, there were these extraordinary shows. I mean, I remember seeing Galliano for the first time and the rawness and the excitement. And you don't, when there's been a great show, you don't forget it. My boss, Fairchild, used to say he could feel it in his toes. I didn't feel it in my toes. But it was exciting. I remember sitting with him and watching Valentino's first couture collection in Paris, because he always showed in Rome before that. I remember sitting next to Mr. Fairchild and him pointing out a jacket, pointing out a suit. He said, look at that suit. It has snap, crackle, and pop. And it was a flawless suit. It was a kind of suit you could wear for 10 hours in an airplane, stand up, no creases. Wow. It was really impeccable, but craftsmanship. But I was very lucky. These amazing people, Warhol, Lagerfeld, Fairchild, who was nicknamed the Ayatollah of fashion. He could be very terrifying.
And then you became this amazing writer. You wrote so many fascinating books. And one of my favorites is Monsieur Dior, Once Upon a Time. I love that book. And people are talking more about the man behind the brand, because many people don't realize the life he had. And in such short amount of time, 10 years, he managed to make Dior a brand that was recognized internationally. And you wrote this book and you did all this research, fantastic research into his life. You went to the place where he lived. And I guess my question is about Christian Dior, this man behind the brand that we all love today.
Yes, I mean, I did a biography before that on Sam Spiegel, the film producer, who was actually born before Dior. And Dior, it's true, and I fell in love. It's funny because I always thought, because of the photographs of Dior, I presumed he was a very bourgeois, kind of successful, but slightly boring person. Not at all. Very excited by artists, very protective of people like Jean Cocteau, Christian Dior, very generous. He was incredibly generous with Yves St Laurent, who was then called Yves St Laurent, who was his dauphin. But Yves St Laurent wasn't easy. And Dior saw that he was brilliant and gave him the mantle, which is very generous. It doesn't always happen in fashion. Some people are scared by talent, and I think that says a lot about Dior. Dior also firmly, Christian Dior, the man, firmly believed that he wanted to make princesses out of all his clients. He was very romantic. And then you see with photographs of him with Rita Hayworth, and you can tell he was just in awe of her beauty. And him with Ava Gardner, his excitement to be with those extraordinary Hollywood icons. But and then there are stories, because I interviewed a lot of different Dior clients who knew him, and they said he was extraordinary because he was so generous and humble and would listen, and very simple, always a doctor's coat, that white coat. And there's one story of this woman called Countess Cristiana Brandolini, and she said, I was being fitted for a jacket, and he came in and he just did 2 little movements and it made all the difference. It's interesting. I think he was unusual for being so involved. And people who knew him said he almost worked too hard. There was such a huge pressure. He had to come up with a hit season. It was then so important. I think but he took it having failed twice in the art world, he took his responsibilities in fashion extremely seriously. Probably, he was a man with huge pressure, but he was also a man who created an international brand. It's interesting, when he died, Women's Wear Daily said, enough to say Dior. He really had made this extraordinary brand, which continues. And there are things which remain. The whole shape, the waist. It's very interesting, because I interviewed models who knew him. And the first thing they did was get measured for a girdle. And then the feet, and then their feet were measured. But it's so interesting, because then it was so tight. Those tiny tops. The whole hourglass figure was very important.
And his sister was also an inspiration to him, wasn't she?
Yes. No, who was a heroine during the war, put into a concentration camp. And no, it was he was so responsible. and very kind. All the models who worked with him said how respectful he was, and tremendous fun. Much more, you know, he had those 3 women working for him, Mitsabrika, and who else? Madame Raymond, who was his assistant, and Madame Marguerite, who was a kind of ogre who made sure that the seams were excellent. She was the woman who was checking all the clothes, because the skirts were huge, very heavy dresses.
And talking about another genius, fashion genius, you often mention that Christian Louboutin transformed your Parisian life.
Yes.
And you discovered him while you were working as a fashion journalist. Tell us a little bit about that.
I met him through India Hicks, the designer and model and daughter of the interior architect and designer David Hicks. And first of all, he was so controlling, Christian. I was like, who is this man? And then he opened the shop and everyone was wearing Louboutin, but the soles were not red. Then he was doing actually a shoe inspired by Warhol, inspired by Warhol's poppy paintings. And there was something missing. And one of his assistants was doing her nails. So he grabbed the nail varnish and painted the sole, and it happened like that. But it's true, Christian, it was meeting Christian was like being in a dark room and someone turning on the light. Because I knew people in Paris, but I did not know Parisians. I kept on thinking, where are the John Cocteaus of today? And, you know, the only people, because of my limited French, the only people I knew were sort of English people and not necessarily people I would have befriended if I'd known them in England, if that makes sense. You know, when you arrive, Parisians are not welcoming. But once they know you love Paris, they're very nice. I have to say, Paris has been very kind to me. But Christian transformed my life. He was so full of life. He was very mischievous and so talented. I remember all his shoes, his early shoes without the red sole. Very funny. And when there was no money, and he would travel with this Iranian assistant called Sarah, and she had the most beautiful legs, but she wasn't allowed to order fish because it was too expensive. When they went to Italy, I mean, we were allowed champagne was allowed because it would get people a little happy and they would buy. Otherwise, it was on a tight budget.
Interestingly enough, all those 3 men, Andy Warhol, Karl Lagerfeld, and Christian Louboutin, have this aura that it becomes almost like cool to hang out with them. I mean, you see all these celebrities always. They're surrounded by beautiful people, by beautiful clients. And Warhol, I guess, was the one who predicted the 15 minutes of fame and all those things.
Extraordinary, extraordinary. And he also taped everything Andy did. I remember this woman, Cristiano Brandolini, saying to me, we were there in the 60s, and there was this weird man photographing everything and taping everything. And he knew before we did. 1960s.
Yeah. And I love the link that you show in your book, this beautiful link that connects Warhol to Lagerfeld to Louboutin as well, the red sole. So
yes, no, I mean, and it is, I think there is something about, certainly, I remember when I was working at Chanel and when Sylvester Stallone was one of the most famous people in the world. And he was there, and then Michael Hutchins from In Excess arrived. And you know, that's the pity that we didn't have Instagram, because it was the most incredible photograph. And who kept it all together was Lagerfeld. And Karl was very, very charming and could talk to anyone. I mean, the last time I spoke to him was it was about 6 months before he died. And it was, what was it? It was the cruise collection. And he was talking to the Australian actress Margot Robbie and the daughter of Caroline of Monaco, the granddaughter of Grace Kelly. And that was Karl. He was ageless. He could mix with any generation. And I think that's the same with Warhol, and it's the same with Christian. You know, these people were fun. But I had no idea, for instance, when I was working at Warhol's studio, that I was living history. It was history. And I had no idea that when I was at Chanel, that it was history as well. Those years were extraordinary. I think if you're living it, you're just living it. You're swimming in it. You're dealing with that minute, that day, that minute, that hour's problem. I remember when Linda Evangelista, Karl did a last minute taffeta green dress, and it was green to match her eyes. She has the most extraordinary cat-like green eyes. And it was to bring out the green in Linda's eyes. So it was this green taffeta dress. And I was in charge of camellias, the Chanel flower. And I had to order an insane amount of camellias, which need to be ready 3 days later or something, in order to attach to the Linda green dress, which was never worn. It was never worn.
As a prolific writer, just mentioned that you published several fascinating books on fashion and luxury, and this fantastic man, Yves St as well. And of course, you have your career as a fashion journalist. What would be your advice, your top tips for people who are thinking about pursuing the same kind of career, either as a writer, or, I mean, a journalist is a writer as well, but, you know, fashion as well, creativity? What would you say to people who are thinking? It doesn't matter even the age, because we also see people who are having a midlife thing and maybe will change careers. So people who are just thinking about going into these fields, in these industries for the first time.
You need a foot in the door. And that may be, first of all, keep your resume to one page. I mean, nowadays, the attachments, you know, with someone doing a portfolio, that's quite different. With email, it's quite different, isn't it? In my day, everything was typed. And now you have attachments, but edit it. If it's not great, don't include it. If you have 5 ideas and 3 are amazing, get rid of 2. People don't have time. Make it as eye-catching and great as possible if you want to be taken on in a studio. But regarding making a career out of writing, it's tough. I'm not going to lie. So you have to really look at, I mean, youth obviously has an obvious appeal to a magazine, but they've got to feel that it's going to work for their readership. So you've really got to work out what's going to work for them. I mean, you've got to be tailor-made. You've got to make your ideas for every magazine. I think it's best to work for a magazine, assist, and then start writing, hopefully write for them. Or, you know, people are so creative on Instagram, on social media. Somehow do something which is eye-catching. I mean, so much is being done on Instagram. So perhaps that should be your focus, and do something really interesting, something that no one else has done. and grab people like that. There's a lot of people out there. So you have to be like no one else, I think. I mean, others may say that's not true, you've got to fit in. I don't agree. I think if you fit in, you're ignored. Catch people's attention. But when you go up for an interview, really research the person you are being interviewed by. I'm surprised how people don't. They're spending time, they are taking time out of their day to talk to you if you're young. So you make the effort to really find out about them. And then there's more of a chance that they're going to take you on. And really, you know, in fashion, really, really go to the library. You know, the books are expensive, but really look and look and look. I mean, from an early age, I was very lucky because my mother was contributor to Vogue. So I went through all the Vogues. I remember them all. But you have to do that. If you really want to be in fashion, I think you really, or now you can look online. But look, you know, there's no excuse now. You've really got to look, but don't copy. Do something which is going to be different.
Find your voice.
Find your voice. Find your voice. Or find your look. Or find your Instagram account. You know, find your niche. When you're innovative and energetic, you can find a way. I think that's so exciting. And even if it's 10 people you've sold to, it's still 10 people. When you're starting, do few pairs. So I remember Christian's Love shoes, the Love. You know, and it was the Love shoes. It was people, oh God, that's good. Become recognizable.
Start small, I guess, as well.
Yeah,
if you
I
want.
always say start small. I always say start small, because you're never big. I don't see the point of big. I remember Christian, it was this little jewel box. Start small, because then people feel they've discovered something, and then it's exciting. It's successful if you like it. You know, I really feel so much emphasis is on success and fame. Personal success is loving your work. And that is so important. Obviously, you have to earn your keep. I mean, I feel that and I say to all my students, you cannot do things for free. It's just not a good idea. It can be a limited amount, but you still have to be paid. If you decide to do a magazine with friends, then that's different. But if you are writing for a blog, not a blog, but if you're writing for a website or writing for a magazine or a newspaper, you have to be paid. You're not a charity, and you won't be respected if you are not paid. It's really important. And some people find it, that's one thing I really liked about America, is how cut and dry they are about money. And it's very like, okay, how much am I going to be paid? It's not a big deal. Whereas in Europe, it's like, oh, she mentioned money. Well, yes. I always ask, I say, how much? And I can tell people are a little surprised. But I am not a charity. I have to wait. I'm a single mother. I have to wait, you know, is it going to work me doing this? I have to know how much. And no one should feel bad or made to feel bad that they dare to ask or ask.
This is an important message to employers as well. Yeah. Because some people they don't think, they just ask you to work for free, especially in the creative industries. So you see that a lot. Yeah.
Internship is different
Mm-hmm.
because you are there to learn. And I know now they pay, and I don't know. I think you're getting back. You're getting takeout. So that's different. When I was asked to do a book on Christian Dior, I really need to make money. I'd been fired. And I fell in love with the subject. And it was a real surprise. So I think I'll always say to people, work experience is vital. And never, unless it's really something which you know won't interest you, you might be surprised. And I say to young people, do every type of experience. When you're young, and perhaps, well, I was lucky because I wasn't sure what I was going to do, so I did everything. And I had to earn my keep, so I was an agent, and I was working Warhol studio, and then I was working, but every experience brings you something. It may be a contact, or it may be a discovery of something you love. You know, working brings an experience. But I think really work is so important. Push yourself. And it's very hard. I know being rejected and rejected and rejected, it's so awful. Because now there are so many people who want to be in fashion. But you've just got to keep on.
So here at 1 Million Voices, of course, we always invite our guests to talk about charities and causes that are making a difference in the world. And Natasha has selected two fantastic organizations. One is the Longford Trust, and the other one is Horatius Garden. So Natasha, tell us why we should help these charities and what they do.
Well, the Longford Trust it was created in memory of my grandfather, Frank Longford, who really believed, and that great line is turning sentences into degrees, because he felt very strongly in prison reform. And he also felt very strongly that if prisoners were educated, they wouldn't continue a life in crime. It was really that sense that education could change their life. And Longford Trust they've turned a sentence into a degree. They've educated all sorts of different people. And they've had the most fantastic success of people who've left prison and gone on to have careers and gone on to mentor people like themselves. It's a continuation. And I just think that's so extraordinary. And I just remember my grandfather, when I was little, he had something called New Horizon, which was giving a chance to people who had left prison. Because often it was very hard then in the 70s. People didn't want to employ people who had just left prison. And New Horizon gave them a chance and mentored them. It's this idea of giving a new life. You know, everyone deserves a second chance.
I come across the Longford Trust. It was shortly after release, where I was experiencing both financial and housing difficulties. After exhausting all avenues, to no avail, it was actually my probation officer who found the Longford Trust online and suggested that I give them guys a try. The Longford Trust have influenced my life a great deal, both financially and emotionally. They provided financial help, which is eased the burden that was placed upon myself, and they provided good direction and a mentor with relevant industry knowledge to help me on my chosen career path. What excites me is being a father for the first time, and I've got a big opportunity now to be a role model for someone else. The future excites me, and the direction it's headed.
Horatio's Garden was created by friends, and in honour of their son Horatio Chapel. And the idea is to, for all those NHS spinal injury victims, they'll have a space, a garden to look at. And it's been very successful. This is an incredible, peaceful area for spinal injury victims. And I just think that I love the idea of that. And the reason why I'm linked to them is because I won a case against the Daily Mail. And the agreement was that I give the money to a charity, and I chose Horatio's Garden. My idea being that toxic behaviour could turn into flowers. And they're always looking for volunteers, Horatio's Garden. But obviously with COVID, it's been a rough moment. And I love the idea of Horatio's Gardens. I think that we so take for granted, again, that we're able to walk and be active. I love the idea that you have these landscape gardeners who are willing to do it for free and giving great pleasure. Flowers just can give great, great pleasure.
Horatio's Garden is a national charity, and we create and nurture beautifully designed, accessible gardens right in the heart of NHS spinal injury centres. Spinal cord injury is a life-changing injury that can happen to any one of us at any time, and after the injury, most people will spend months in hospital.
About 14 weeks ago I had a spinal stroke just out of the blue, getting ready for work, and I had this horrific pain in the bottom of my back and my legs were gone. I'm just keeping my fingers crossed and staying positive that I will again walk. I absolutely love Horatio's Garden. It's peaceful, it's beautiful, it's helped my recovery. It just helps you unwind, relax, and just forget where you are and what you're doing here, really. It is lovely for bringing relatives, and there are some conversations when you perhaps think about things and think, well, you never will walk again. And it does definitely help. I think it's the tranquility of it all.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for your time today. It was a pleasure. Such a shame that we couldn't be next to each other, but hopefully next time. And thank you so much for wisdom, for sharing your knowledge. I'm sure people who are watching are going to learn a lot from your experiences, and also letting us know about these wonderful two charities. And I hope people get connected and engage with them. And thank you for your time. Thank you so much. You're wonderful.
Thank you, Katya, always.
If you enjoyed watching this interview, don't forget to like, leave your comment, share the link, and subscribe to the channel. You can also follow us on social media. This is a very exciting moment for the 1 Million Voices project, as we are just starting out. So I invite everyone to join us. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.